My name is Catherine Heath. In behalf of the Planned Giving Committee, we'd like to welcome you to our annual Professional Advisors Forum. I'm super excited to introduce our keynote speaker today, but first I just want to mention the group on the committee who I think almost everybody is here today. Jeff Wood is co-chair, and Dan Stazak, where are you? Sorry, glasses are going to do this. Sil Reggiardo, Bill Altavilla, Christine Reed, you're somewhere out there. I think I saw Christine Kovaris. She's somewhere in the back. Oh, there you are. I see you now. Gianna Ellerman is out visiting grandbabies today. And Bill Roby is out sick, so not a lot of comedy at the end of this session today. Unless, Dan, you want to jump in and be the comedian for us today. And I don't think I missed anybody else, but we really appreciate you joining us again for this annual event. We really enjoy being able to bring education to you and connecting and getting to know those of us in the community that are helping our clients and helping our clients with planned giving. So I'd like to introduce the keynote speaker, and I'm just super excited. I've had the pleasure of talking with Sanjay several times over the last probably 6 months. I think we've been courting you to come and speak with us today. So this is Sanjay Varshney, and sorry, hopefully I didn't ruin that for you. He is the founder and principal of Goldenstone Wealth Management, and I love his little tagline over there, if you saw that. He's also chief economist and publisher for Sacramento Business Review, and a professor of finance at Sacramento State University. So he's doing many, many things. He took time out of his day today to be able to speak to us, and I'm super thrilled to have him. So thank you so much, Sanjay. I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. Find the clicker here. How are you all doing today? It's a beautiful day to be inside. Could be on the golf course maybe, right? But thank you again for having me as the keynote. I didn't realize I was going to be the keynote. I saw other speakers too on the agenda. So I'm glad to be here. I'm local. I've been in El Dorado Hills for the last 18 years. Wear multiple hats. I'm hoping you guys can see the screen. I'm not sure how well you can see the screen, right? So amongst all the hats I wear, I also produce the Regional Economic Forecast, which I've been doing for the last 14, 15 years now. So you see that copy on your table. It goes out to literally about 8,000, 9,000 business owners in the Sacramento region every 6 months. And then of course we also do an actual event live at Sac State every January. We would love to welcome you guys as well. We usually have 1,000 people that show up. I was just telling other folks, we've had people like Warren Buffett, Janet Yellen in the past as speakers. Then we decided that they were too powerful speakers, right? So yeah, so we want to have people like me too, right? On the stage, just joking. So it's a great event. If you ever have any interest, let me know, and of course we can send you the information regarding the forecast. So the business review is going to be part of my presentation today. But of course, I would love to make comments first about where I see the national economy, where I see the markets in general, and then of course, try and zero in on our own backyard. We have wonderful partners. The forecast that you see on the table, the publication is a public service for the region. So this is not something that we do as like a for-profit kind of deal. Purely on our own dime, on our own time. And we have found that it's widely respected purely because we have a great team of folks who actually write the report and produce it. And like I said, it's been fairly popular. I'd like to start with this quote, which is very timely, in my opinion. It's from Warren Buffett. Well, I'm not suggesting that I'm a big fan of his, but on the flip side, it's a great quote that says, only when the tide goes out do you know who's been swimming naked, right? So in COVID, during 2020, we got caught swimming naked. 2022, we got caught swimming naked because if you adjust in the stock market and the bond market and nothing else, you took a big hit because both the markets went down at the same time, right? Which doesn't happen very often. And so you got to find ways to make sure that you have a strategy to get through some really bad times, right? And 2022, I don't think anybody was predicting that both those markets are going to take a huge hit. So some of the recent headlines, not so positive, right? So let me see if I can just walk you through some doom and gloom first before I throw some light on it, right? Inflation hitting 42-year plus highs. Stock market crashed into bear market. Bond market crashed too. Recession is imminent. They've been using that word pretty often. Banks fell due to fallout from the rates. Most recently, First Republic, right? And you can see that is still a major theme because this morning we saw some other regional banks coming under pressure and their stocks selling off. Debt ceiling and the drama that's going on right now, right? Whether the Treasury is going to run out of cash soon. Iran has two new friends, right? China and Russia. And then of course we have two people wanting to run again, right? And that's probably going to be interesting because 2024 is going to be election year. And election years are always very interesting for the stock market and everything else in the capital markets, right? Some other headlines which are more closer to home because we are in a very heavily real estate driven region. Mortgage demand lowest in 22 years. Mortgage refinancing down more than 85%. New applications down more than 50%. And then some of the most cooling off markets happen to be right here in California. Although Sacramento did okay with population growth at least compared to some other places. So no surprise, mortgage rates, 30-year fixed, crossed 7%. And then of course they've cooled off since then because the 10-year treasury is down. But clearly that has taken a toll in many spots on the housing market because the affordability was already very poor, especially in California. And suddenly now you find that everything is so expensive. Affordability declined by more than 50% in these last couple of years, just purely because where the housing market was going with a very low rate environment. California usually shows up as one of the most unaffordable states. What I found interesting was now you see Montana and Idaho also ranking as two of the most unaffordable states in the country for housing purely because they can thank Californians for it, right? Because Californians have moved there and Californians, wherever they move to, is not always usually a good thing, right? So what I found very interesting for Sacramento was that as of the most recent data, if you are making $100,000 in your paycheck in Sacramento, which is considered to be a pretty good paycheck here, by the way, in Sacramento. You know, we're not the Bay Area, right? You can afford less than 10% of the listings that are out there on sale in the housing market. If you're making $50,000, which is typically what a young student from Sac State makes on the way out, you can afford less than 0.38%. 0.38%, less than 1% of all the listings that are out there for homes to buy. So if you're asking whether we have a homelessness crisis besides for reasons of mental health, there are some other challenges, economic challenges, where people are just priced out. So this is not a very happy market. We celebrate the housing market doing well in California and especially in the region here, but we forget that we also need jobs outside or working for a Safeway or working for a dental office or a medical office because we are a very strong service sector region. We are not a very high manufacturing region or a high-tech region, right? In fact, Intel just announced multiple layoffs. And so even the one anchor employer in Folsom is right now pretty much showing signs of decline, right? Are we there yet? So we're talking about the recession, right? This is what my kids used to ask on road trips, right? And now we're on this road trip to a recession. And we don't know yet because everything looks so beautiful and strong in the economy, right? Where is the recession? I mean, every other evening when I go out for a meal to a restaurant or if I'm going out to doing shopping, it looks like people are still throwing money at everything, right? It's not like I can get into a restaurant without making a reservation easily. So I think the economy is still very strong. If there is a recession, maybe it might show up in 24, but suddenly nothing in 23. But even if there was one, because now we are arguing, like I said, they're using the term imminent, and again, there is some shifting away from the term imminent. But really, it should be a shallow one because history has shown any inflation-induced or any interest rate hike-induced recession was actually a pretty mild one. So if we do see one in 2024, we probably should expect a shallow recession, and then we can move on from there. Now, this is probably the first time in my lifetime, and of course, I've seen plenty of rate hikes before, that we have seen 10 rate hikes, the fastest ever in about a year's time, where we have gone from 0 to 500 basis points, right? Even my Porsche cannot actually speed up that fast, right? But I can see that the Fed has been really, really pushing down the pedal, right? And usually what happens is, I find it very fascinating when I'm watching CNBC or Bloomberg or some of these channels, and they're all debating instant gratification from that. I'm saying that typically doesn't happen. Usually there's at least a 6 months to a 1 year lag by the time the Fed does something, and that shows up in the rest of the economy. So if you ask me, of course, these are my personal views, we are probably 50 basis point overdone because I think the damage is done. A lot of damage in the background, like for example, the banking crisis is collateral damage. The labor market has not taken a hit yet, but you are seeing signs of weakening even in the labor market. But I think at this point in time, the damage is pretty severe. And the people who are arguing that the interest rates have to be higher than inflation for inflation to come down should finally feel pretty good. Because right now, at this point in time, our interest rates are higher than what inflation is, right? Because inflation, the reading that came out yesterday was 4.9%. And even if you take X food and energy, it was like 5.5. So I think at this point in time, we can safely say that we should be done. The Fed should back off at this point in time. Federal funds rate, if you go back into history, you're going to find that we were at the lowest rates for almost a decade, at 0% post 2008, 2009 crisis. And if I compare that to the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, it's a fascinating chart that shows that we have systematically taken the cost of borrowing at the Federal Reserve level down to 0 and kept it there for infinite amounts of time, primarily because governments across the world are getting used to taking a lot of borrowed money and spending more because they like to spend more, right? So we are now caught in that debt ceiling thing again, that hey, we gotta borrow more, we have $32 trillion already in public debt, but who cares, right? If your grandchildren will have to stand for a passport for another country, because looks like that's the way we're headed, right? With the debt we have taken. So the public debt, but again, if I look across the world, most central governments have done that. It's not just the United States. So that's a challenge going forward. Our deposits. So right now, for example, everybody's complaining about deposits rolling out from the banks. We pumped roughly $10 trillion in the name of COVID into the US markets and economy, right? Of which you can see for roughly $6-7 trillion showed up as additional deposits at the banks. So the banks actually lend that money out, right? Because that's what they do. They actually take the money through deposits, they lend that money out for businesses, but then when the going gets rough, which is what happened in the last few months, now it's a tough deal because you're paying a lot more on short-term rates, you're not getting much in long-term rates, right? And deposits are flowing out. Why? Because you see some folks actually spending, because remember, all that COVID money, the stimulus money, is being spent somewhere by the economy. Folks are taking that money out, and then of course we also see runs on the banks, where some people got so scared, they actually withdrew money even if they didn't need it. So we are seeing that deposit flow now turn negative, which is not a healthy thing. So banking sector obviously is under pressure. Tightening. Bank lending standards have tightened tremendously. All my friends who are looking for a new car and trying to finance it, or they're trying to buy a new house and finance it, or trying to find something else to finance it, they're all basically complaining about the same thing. Cost of borrowing has gone up. Doesn't matter if you're a business, doesn't matter if you're an individual or a household, you are basically paying a lot more for credit. And credit is not easy anymore. All that free money that we put on the table through COVID is no longer there the way it used to be, right? So in a way, if you ask me, does this have an impact that can be substituted for the Federal Reserve raising the rates another couple of times? The answer is yes. I would easily say, hey, the banks are not lending as much, or they're charging a lot more. That in effect is automatically another Fed rate hike or 2 or maybe 3 because that hurts the economy. Labor market has astounded people. Even today, we have 9 million job openings, only 5 million people available to fill those jobs. Many people don't want to come back to work because post-COVID, they have enjoyed this flexibility of just being at home. But the money is running out. Money is running out. So you can see labor participation rate has gone up. More people are coming back to work, which is a good thing. And that's the reason why I think a labor market has shown strength. Wage inflation has come down. So no longer can you basically just argue with your boss and tell them to go to hell if you don't get a 25% raise immediately, right? That has changed too, by the way. So you can't do that anymore. The quit rate, hey, you know what? I'm going to just send a text message to my boss and say I quit. That has changed too. Because the labor market, like I said, is tightening in the background. It's just not noticeable enough because the unemployment rate stands at about 3.4%. And 3.4% is the lowest we have seen in the last 60 or 70 years, right? Housing market is cooling off. No surprise, because like I said, with the rest of the economy under pressure, and of course the mortgage rates haven't gone up as much as they did. San Francisco is leading the major metropolitan cities for decline in the median housing values. And you might say, well, is that a bad thing? And I say, not necessarily, because San Francisco is also overinflated. Because for 1.5 million, you could barely buy a closet there that could fit you, right? And I used to live there, by the way, so I know exactly what an apartment or Russian Hill would cost for rent, or how much we would pay for a condo or a house in that area if you wanted to be in a nice spot, right? So housing market is cooling off. It's for some people it's bad news, not necessarily very bad news because, like I said, things got too unaffordable. In El Dorado Hills, I just saw the data. We're down about 12% year over year. So 12% year over year is not a bad place to be, again, given that our homes in many cases went up 50% post-COVID, right, in just a year or two. So median home prices are coming down nationally. So that is, a lot of people say, well, is that going to be a bad wealth effect? Because if housing prices are crashing, will that actually now cause the economy to go into a recession, or whether it's going to basically cause a market crash somewhere? What we have seen so far is we're chronically undersupplied for housing in the United States. Doesn't matter, even if you look at California, that becomes exaggerated. So the inventory levels are so low that we do see support for the housing market in that sense. And that's why we are less pessimistic, or at least I'm less pessimistic about the housing market crash that's going to cause a huge problem for the economy someplace. In fact, if anything, our inflation, CPI headline number, will come down more because I've seen numbers where if you take the current housing prices and the rents, our actual inflation is not 4.9%. It's closer to about 3.5 or maybe under. So because we are using lag data on inflation in the headline CPI, that headline CPI number actually is a misleading number. Our personal savings rate hit rock bottom at 2%. We're slowly now rebounding from that 2%. During the peak of COVID, our savings rate was 36% because we got so much money free from the government, right? And so our savings rate was at 36. We went down to 2. Now it's more like 5. And money is drying up, like I said, which is a good thing because people who really didn't want to come back to work, especially the younger people who didn't want to come back to work, are being forced to come back to work, which is wonderful. House debt service ratios are still under control. So one of the things we watch very closely is, hey, by the way, in your household budget, are you over indebted? And then what's your cost of servicing that debt, right? And that is still under control. So that's why when you ask the question, hey, are we going to have this huge collapse in the economy? I'm looking around and saying I can't see it because we are still a very healthy household budget. By the way, we hit $140 trillion in household wealth last year. So collectively, we all own $140 trillion, right? Of course, you can argue that the top 10% owns 80% of that, right? And the bottom 50% owns less than 2% of that. Everything has flip-flopped. The worst performing sectors of last year are the best performing sectors of this year so far, right? So technology was horrible, communication services was horrible, right? If you look at the Amazons of the world and the Googles of the world, right? They took big hits last year. This year you can see that reversion coming back. And so the best sectors from last year are underperforming. The worst sectors are overperforming. A lot of people complain about the market being overvalued and out of whack. Every day I watch CNBC, if somebody shows up that says market should crash to 3,200. I'm not sure exactly what data they're reading because it's hard to make that case. If you look at where the earnings are right now or where everything else is, of course, external shocks can easily drive us down. One external shock, like a major nuclear, trigger somewhere between Russia or someplace else, we could see those shocks. But those shocks are not there yet, right? So it's hard to make the case that the markets are severely overvalued based on where we are. Hard to read this chart, but that just shows you first quarter, Q1 of 2023 was delightful in the stock market and the bond market and every other market. Last year, we had to spend a lot of time moving a bunch of our portfolio money into private capital. Because the only place where we could make single-digit returns or high, or maybe a low double-digit was if you were in private credit, private debt, private real estate, private equity. If we had stayed just in the 60-40 kind of a portfolio or just stuck our necks out in the stock and the bond market, our clients would be very miserable. Thankfully, they're not miserable because, like I said, we did a lot of work into the private capital. But this year, first quarter, like I said, everything is looking good. The good news is, bull markets are long, bear markets are very short. So at least I see the point that there's hope because we had a really rough bear market. And now if we trigger off a new bull cycle, that bull market could be an extremely strong one. Even if the drawdowns are very severe, I didn't realize the room setup is going to be like this. I thought there's going to be a giant size screen with me on that screen, right? So you can easily read my stuff. But it's very hard to read. Even if the drawdowns are severely negative, doesn't mean you close out the year on a negative note. You can actually still close out the year on a positive note. So I would like to think that there's a high probability you're going to close out 23 on a positive note. We have shown this chart to so many of our clients because when all hell breaks loose, everybody wants to throw in the towel, right? And completely bail out. If you're fully invested, and this chart goes back to the last 20 years. If you were fully invested for 20 years versus missed the 20 best trading days in those 20 years, you lose half your return, right? So the question is, how can you predict now which 20 days not to be in the market for the next 1 year, right? Very hard. Finally, I guess, on the economic front, expansions typically last about 5 years plus, and then recessions last typically a year. So worst case scenario, I tell my business owner clients, if you really need to worry about the recession, plan your strategy for the next 1 year, and then you'll be fine. Because you just need to make sure that you don't basically run into challenges for the 1 year. But then, of course, there are more serious challenges that nobody cares about, right? I thought I would try and throw more doom and gloom, right? I hope you had a great lunch, by the way, right? So you can digest these news, right? First, our interest payments from a federal budget is right now at about 6% of the total budget. That interest service payments is going to go to 10% pretty soon. And we don't have the money, by the way, because we're already talking about raising the debt ceiling to pay for everything else. So this is a dangerous place to be going forward because the refinancing of the debt is very, very difficult. The public debt for every American is looking worse and worse. If a child that is born today is already in debt by $75,000, and by the time they turn 18, it's going to be about $125,000. So you can see how that number is climbing. So our kids and our grandkids and their kids are going to be screwed, right? But who cares? Like I said, because we care about our lives, right? The per capita spending, right, has climbed, right, insanely because the government is spending a lot of money, not just the state government, but also the federal government, right? And then, by the way, it took us 215 years to add 7 trillion to our debt, and took us exactly 2 years to add another 7 trillion. So we are really good at adding trillions of debt, right? That's our expertise now. One more, our public debt has exceeded 100% of GDP. right? Now, you can say, well, look at Japan, or look at some other countries, and they are 200% plus of GDP. So should we really care? All I can say is Japan has been in a recession for the last 25 years. So if you want to do the same thing and be in a recession for 25 years, let's do it. God bless you. All right, I'm going to shift some gears real quick and go through a few slides. I know I'm running out of time here. I'm good on time? Okay. How about the regional market, right? How about our own backyard here? How about Sacramento region? So first thing is, hey, we came back pretty good from the COVID, right? So our labor market is looking pretty good. Our unemployment rate is pretty low. Typically, California rate is higher than the national average. That's exactly where we are. Our backyard, we find that leisure and hospitality has really picked up in the last 1 year. Initially, minimum wage labor, you couldn't find anybody to work for you. Now, at least you can find labor because people are willing to come back to work, right? So this basically shows you that we had job growth in every sector except for retail. So we had job creation, especially strong in the construction, 17.4%. Okay, so this is a very strong number. And then, of course, across the board, you can see leisure and hospitality had another very good number, like 7%, transportation and warehousing, 9.9%. So in general, good labor market. The challenges, if I look at California and also our own backyard, we have a white skills gap. So when you ask the question, why do we have 5 million more jobs than the number of people who can fill those jobs? Shouldn't everybody have a job? The answer is no, because we have a white skills gap. There's a lot of jobs that require skill sets that are not produced, especially by the local universities. How do I know that? Because I teach for one, right? So you might say, well, are you guilty of that too? I'm not going to talk about that today, right? But in general, the new skills, we're talking about artificial intelligence, robotics, we're talking about so many different things. The universities are outdated with what they teach in the classroom. They're highly overrated for what they charge you and what they produce for education. But education is an emotional need of people. So people like to invest in education. So if you look at what's really showing up on the right side as high demand areas, and what we are producing on the left side as what we are producing locally, there's a complete mismatch. Complete mismatch. 70% of the majors being produced by UC Davis or Sac State cannot find a job in our region because those jobs don't exist. And then the jobs do exist, especially in the healthcare industry, where the demand is very strong. We can't find enough people coming out from these universities, right? So that's the mismatch. You can see it in the publication. It's easier to read there. But the same thing happens, like I said, locally too, where we have this wide mismatch in the skill set. So if you look at the 3 largest employers in Sacramento, they're not Intel and Apple. They're really Kaiser, right? Dignity Health, Sutter, right? Those are the largest employers we have. And healthcare is doing well in Sacramento. But we're not producing enough healthcare experts to be able to take those jobs. Consumer is clearly not feeling good. Our sentiment is slightly weaker than the national sentiment, but I'm not surprised because we took a very severe hit compared to everybody else during the COVID time. Expectations for prices or inflation for the next year. This is a lagging indicator. So when we surveyed people, we found amazingly that even though inflation is coming down, everybody's still very upset about inflation. And therefore, when we ask them, what are you really concerned about next year? They're saying inflation. Although inflation is down, like I said, it's down to 4.9. The 4.9 will probably look more like 4 pretty soon, right? And then it may not look like 2%, but I can tell you guys, when we were at 2%, we used to complain we are too low on inflation because the producers didn't have enough pricing power. They wanted inflation to go up to more like 3% at that time. You couldn't get a very good raise from your employer because of your raise. The raise you would get would be like 1.5, 2%, and then the employer would tell you, oh, we're just matching inflation. And then you would get all upset, saying, well, I wish inflation was higher, right? So I would get a higher raise, right? So again, that is playing out in the background right now. Types of credit plan. Across the board, I think people are now becoming more conservative. And whether you're looking for an auto loan or you're looking for a home equity loan or you're looking for a credit card, whatever you're looking for, things are actually now cooled off quite a bit. Small businesses are also in the toilet. They're not feeling very good about next year. The sentiment is pretty low. This is both national and regional and local. We have seen a massive decline in access to credit. Now, with what happened in the last few weeks with the banking crisis, that access to credit has become even more difficult. So if you're a small business looking for loans, it is becoming more and more difficult. SBA lending has gone down, so we're tracking, the loans that are sent out in the region. That is not looking very good. Loans by county, doesn't matter. We dissect the data and look at every county across the board. SBA lending has gone down, and access to credit is not looking very good. Manufacturing, as much as manufacturing is coming back to the United States, California is simply not a great name for manufacturing. So it's not just a local problem for us, it's a California problem. California is not a very pro-manufacturing state. We have too many regulations and too many challenges for business owners wanting to do manufacturing in the state. So I'm not surprised that manufacturing has taken a decline. The next few charts, again, I'm going to just go through because these are not exactly the most current. They're about 2 or 3 months old, so I have to at least preface that and make sure I'm giving you the right commentary. Housing market in the region has cooled off. In the last 2 months, we saw an uptick in the number of sales, or even in the median price, or even in the cost per square foot of those sales, purely because the mortgage rates went from 7% to a much lower number, making homes more affordable suddenly. Because the 10-year treasury, don't forget, hit 4% plus, and then declined back down to 3.5%. So the 30-year fixed rate mortgage did the same thing. It hit a high of 7% plus, and then declined. And so suddenly people found homes were more affordable again. So the last 2 months we saw a slight uptick, but I won't be surprised if that's going to be a short-lived uptick. And once again, you see a decline follow. Price per square foot of construction, it keeps going up because of inflation. The median home prices are cooling off. In the local region, and I'm sure you guys are watching the news, commercial real estate, which is 5% of transaction volume in Sacramento, but much larger in San Francisco and New York and some of these other cities. In San Francisco, a $300 million building cannot sell for $60 million. I'm sure you're watching the news, the same news I watch, right? So imagine the damage you're seeing in commercial real estate, which hasn't become obvious yet. In Europe, the back to the office rate is close to about 80 to 90%. In Asia, the back to the office rate is 100%. In the United States, we are still at 50%. So the back to office rate is basically going to have an impact on office space going forward, we know that. And regional banks have 75 to 80% plus of the portfolios linked to real estate. So that's where my concern is that, hey, by the way, when you look at these regional banks, and they have so much money in commercial real estate, right? Or residential real estate for that matter, will they be okay? So we'll see. Again, I'm not making any strong statements either way, but given the fallout that I've seen in the banking sector, we gotta be watching those. Office volume is down. The rents are coming down. Vacancy rates are climbing, even in the local region, just like they are nationally. So no surprise there. Industrial is holding up very well in Sacramento. So we are a very attractive corridor for industrial. We are short on more warehousing, and that we could actually bring in more. So industrial, I think, remains our bright spot, and probably will remain for the foreseeable future because of the demand and supply equation. Regional banks, like I said, were doing good. Our the loans and the deposits and the net margins were all looking good. I have not seen the last 1 month of data. So all my charts are at least 3 months old or 4 months old. So at that time, our regional banks looked very strong. Our credit unions looked very strong. It would be fascinating to see exactly what the next round of data is going to show for both the credit unions and for the regional banks here. This is our financial conditions index for Sacramento. We bring everything home into one chart. Which basically shows you how we are doing overall. And you can see we took a massive hit during COVID, but we are well above the pre-COVID days. So our regional economy has come back very strong, very nicely. This is a great place to live. We have seen a massive influx from the Bay Area. The reason why our home values have gone up more than they should have. And I think we are going to continue to see that because the exodus from the Bay Area is very strong. And now it's going to probably stay that way, at least for a while. I don't know if you guys follow the Bay Area Economic Council reports from the Bay Area. I do. They have been doing surveys for the last several years, and they have found that most people they surveyed who live in the Bay Area, 50%, close to 50%, have been saying consistently they want to get the hell out. They just don't like the traffic and the crime and the smash and grab. And every day in Oakland and San Francisco, cars are getting broken into. People are leaving notes in their windshield saying, "Please, I have nothing in my car. Please don't break my glass," right? And every day, my car was broken into too, by the way. I was just there visiting for a dinner, and it got broken into, right? So it is a terrible place to visit now. Finally, we surveyed the local managers and employees in this region to see what they're saying. We found this fascinating. 82% said no, they're not willing to quit, which is a sharp contrast to the quit rate we were seeing post-COVID, where people said, "Oh, I'm gonna resign, find a better job that pays me more," right? Are you pursuing more education? 74% said yes, right? So again, this is a sign that education is an emotional need, right? People invest in education. This is HR activities with the greatest anticipated impact on business performance in 23. So compensation and benefits was the most rated priority for employees and managers this past year. And then if you ask about going forward, where do you see the most pressures on you? Pressure and cost reduction was ranked number 1. Talent shortage was ranked number 2. Skills gap was ranked number 3. And then you can see everything else was ranked number 5 or 6 or 7 or 8, right? Healthcare is doing well in the region. Massive shortage, like I said. We still have a lot of growth left in the region. Tourism and hospitality has picked up. So we looked at the Visit Sacramento data to see how the hotels are doing and how the airport is doing, for example. Traffic has picked up. Hotels are doing better. They're charging more per night. They're collecting more revenue per night from the hotel rooms. So all that stuff is very positive. I would say those are good signs that our economy, from a leisure and hospitality standpoint, has come back. Challenges that I've been talking about for 15 years, but nobody cares, right? So I thought I would put them on the table one more time. Loss of population. We have lost population for the last 10 years now. Last 3 years, very obvious. That people are moving out just like businesses were moving out. They can't afford to stay in California. Loss of the top 1% of wealth and income. So by the way, when I was at Wells Private Bank, our team used to help people move to Reno or Las Vegas or other places, right? Why? Because they were paying ridiculous amounts of taxes. The 1% top earners and wealth in California accounts for half the general fund for the state budget. So when they move out, and we are predicting a 25 billion plus shortfall starting out this year. So that shortfall is going to grow. So the deficit, we went from a 95 billion surplus last year to a $25 billion shortfall this year, right? So you can see how fast things move. Budget deficit, housing and affordability, rising homelessness, rising crime, averages are skewed and misleading. A lot of people think, oh, this is something I gave interviews on the media. So they said, hey, California is now the 4th largest economy in the world. What do you think? I said, that's wonderful, but that does not mean that everybody living in California is rich and famous, right? Because you're looking at averages. Don't look at averages that are skewed by the billionaires from the tech industry in the Bay Area or from Southern California, right? China is the 2nd largest economy in the world. Doesn't mean that they don't have poor Chinese living there, right? So our challenges are still there, regardless of the fact that our economy today has reached the 4th largest in size. In general, I think there are enough tailwinds, in my opinion, to feel pretty good about where we are. So I know a lot of people are still very concerned about a recession. I keep pointing out to the fact that inflation is coming down, it's moving in the right direction. The Fed should pause, I'm hoping they will pause. If all goes well, we can engineer a soft landing, we can. It's just a matter of policy error. To what extent will egos come into play? So Neil Kashkari, he was my guest speaker a few years ago. In fact, he used my platform to announce his candidacy for governor that year. He is today sounding like a huge hawk. This morning on CNBC, he says, oh, the rates need to go up another few times. I'm saying, well, that's wonderful, but that's your ego talking. You want to be in the news. You want to be on CNBC with those sound bites. But economically, do we really need another couple of rate hikes? The answer is no, right? So I'm optimistic. I'm an optimistic guy. I think if you can engineer a soft landing, we can, we should. But of course, there can always be policy errors and mistakes made by the government with the debt ceiling negotiations that are going on right now, with the Fed rate hikes, with the war going on in Ukraine, with Iran finding new friends. There's a lot that can go wrong between now and the next year's an election year. So we'll see what that goes. Thank you so much for having me as a speaker today. I hope I gave you some food for thought. I don't want to leave you on a doom and gloom note. I'm very optimistic. I think our economy is doing well at this point in time, and this too shall pass, because I've seen this happen before time and again. We just have short-term memories. So let me stop there.
Thank you. Any questions real quick for Sanjay? I mean, that was a whirlwind of excellent information. I was jotting a bunch of notes down, but you know, I think a couple summaries I see is, hey, let's stay optimistic, and when we have somebody as knowledgeable as Sanjay here, we can have the knowledge behind us to do that and have his optimism. Any questions? I had one real quick. You mentioned commercial real estate with a concern on the banks and their balance sheets. With many of our clients being state workers of some impact, where does CalPERS sit with any concern? Because I know they do have a lot of commercial real estate on their books.
Yeah, the difference between, I think, CalPERS and CalSTRS, the major difference between CalPERS and CalSTRS, and even fund managers like us, and maybe many others who are much more, I think, concentrated, they have concentrated risk in commercial real estate that's more regional and more local, is that there's a lot of investment made by CalPERS, CalSTRS, people like us, into very diversified opportunities that are not necessarily just commercial real estate. So for example, if you look at private real estate, right, outside of what's happening, for example, with commercial stuff, right? There's so much other revenue streams, whether it's multifamily housing, whether it's niche revenue streams coming from high-end assisted living centers being built, university dorms and upscale living being built, hospitals and healthcare facilities going up all over the world. So when you look at, for example, I'm just going to put out a few names because those are the names that we use in our portfolio. But if you look at KKR, you look at Blackstone, you look at Carlyle, you look at Cliffwater, you look at Ares, these managers are diversified not just in the US geography or the local geography of California. They have boots on the ground in Singapore, Tokyo, London, Hong Kong, Paris, New York, Sydney. So what happens is much better diversified, and the revenue streams are much more robust compared to, for example, retail and office space that we know are going to take a hit. So, and they're already taking a hit. So that's where I was talking about the regional banks, because the national banks, again, are very well diversified. Regional banks tend to have much more concentrated portfolio loans. Geographic, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you. Thanks, Sanjay. All right, well, we're going to shift gears here just a little bit. This thing does keep going in and out. I thought you were hitting the power button or something. So we're going to shift gears here just a little bit and transition to a couple other topics. Some of our internal team here from our foundation giving, well, not giving circle, our committee members here. So we've got next up with Bill Altavilla and Sil Reggiardo. Bill is a wealth manager, endowment, and foundation nonprofit financial advisor based in Folsom, California. Bill has over 30 years of financial advising experience, recently joined Capstone in 2021. He's a fellow graduate of UC Santa Barbara, go Gauchos, and holds an MBA from National University. He's married with 3 children and very involved in the community, especially the Sac Region Foundation and, of course, our El Dorado Community Foundation Plan Giving Committee. Sil is an attorney and partner with Downey brand. He assists clients in structuring business and wealth transfers. Also a member of our acclaimed El Dorado Community Foundation Giving Circle. Sil's a graduate with his law degree from NYU. I don't have a mascot for that, sorry. And is a fellow with the American College of Trust and Estate Counsel. Sil lives in Cameron Park, and with his wife Joy, they have 3 adult children, and as he quotes it, 1 really fun grandchild. So grandchild is how old?
3.5.
3.5? Okay, so that's a busy kid. All right, well, welcome up. We're going to have Bill and Sil. Thank you.
Another speaker for those behind
So we're going to switch gears a little bit, as Jeff said. We're going to be talking a little bit about, and the discussion did include a lot of discussion about interest rates and how interest rates affect the economy, but they also affect split interest trusts, which we're going to be talking about and how that works. So the way that, where's the, there it is. The first thing we want to talk about is how these split interest trusts fit into a giving pyramid for donors. As you can see, a lot of us give outright gifts to charity, and then there's a lot of people that do bequests related to their estate plan. But as you get closer to the top of the pyramid, those are the techniques we're going to be talking about today, which is the charitable remainder trust and the charitable lead trust. And those valuations of the actual charitable remainder or the deduction you get changes with interest rates. And the interest rates, as we've talked about, have gone up quite a bit. And so this is the rate that the IRS uses or makes us use to determine what the charitable beneficiary gets as a tax deduction. And as you can see, back in 2000, it was 7.4, and then you can see we got into the Great Recession and it came way down. 2020 pandemic came way down. And then you can see it's starting to go back up, and now it's up to 5%, but it's still not quite to where it was back in 2000. So interest rates are really normalizing, but we're so used to how low they've been that this is like a crazy jump for us. So I think that's something that we'll be talking about. Now, Sil, go ahead and start on the next slide.
Yeah, we'll see. This is the microphone that was cutting out. So let's go to the next slide. So what we're talking about today, the focus of our talk is on how rising interest rates, as reflected in the 75-20 rate, Internal Revenue Code Section 75-20 rate, have impacted charitable remainder trusts and why they are more beneficial at this point. So the easiest way to think about this is to start with future value and present value. And so we have an example in the slides, a very basic. If you start with 100, I hope I got this right. I've got a finance professor right here. But you start with $100, and if you assume a growth rate, which is not just, it's overall return, right? It's not just your interest and dividends and rents, it could be appreciation, but you assume a growth rate of 10%, you're going to have $110 next year, which means the present value of $110 discounted at 10% for a year is $100. And in the next example, we have a 20% growth rate, gets you out the curve to 120. So the present value of $120 will be received a year from now at a discount rate of 20%, also $100. So what happens is the higher your discount rate, your assumed growth rate, the lower your present value. And so when we're talking about split interest trust, which we'll talk about in more detail, we're basically carving the trust up into a charitable component and a non-charitable component. Well, if we're doing a present value calculation, they're both going down, right? The higher the interest rate, the lower the value of both components. So why would it make sense then that the charitable remainder trust value would go up? If we're doing a charitable lead trust, which we'll talk a little bit about, it makes perfect sense. You're talking about discounting a present value of a stream of cash flows that's going to the charitable recipients. Easy. But with a remainder trust, it's less intuitive. And so The valuation, by the way, is in regulation section 1.664-4, and it'll send you through several subsections, but basically it's the present value of the remainder interest. That would be your potential deduction. And so as interest rates rise and the 75-20 rate rises, the assumed rate of return rises. And with a charitable remainder trust, you've got a couple things going on. You've got to look at that discount rate, and then you also have to look at the payout, because they're related. And so I've got one simple example that says that if a trust earns, and again, total return, 2% pays out 5%, you're eating into principal. You have to. So when you get to the end of the life of the charitable remainder trust, when the assets will be distributed to charity, you're going to have less than what you started with. Whereas today, as we saw from the chart, we're at about a 5% 75-20 rate. I'm not positive that's exactly where it is now, but that's where it was recently. If you're earning 5% and paying out 5%, you're treading water. So you get to the end of the term and you haven't lost anything. So you're discounting. You're still running a present value calculation, but you're discounting from a higher value, which is why it's intuitive for a charitable lead trust that when your interest rates rise, your present value goes down, your deduction goes down, because your potential deduction, I should say, if the account's out there, your potential deduction is essentially the value of the assets minus the charitable interest fair market value, the present value of the charitable stream. For the remainder trust, it's just less intuitive because you have to take into account both of those factors, both things that are going on. So split interest trust, as I mentioned, you've got charitable and non-charitable components. We've got the remainder trust and the lead trust. And in effect, you can have these be either for a lifetime or lifetimes, or for a term for years. In the remainder trust context, no more than 20 years. And we have all these different legal requirements. So now I'm going to just get into a little bit of tax law, which I like to do. So we have annuity trust and unit trust. Annuity, you essentially take a percentage of the initial value, that's what you get paid, right, every year. So let's say you're doing a charitable remainder trust, the annuity is not going to go down. If the value of the assets goes up, the annuity stays the same. Goes down, stays the same. A unit trust, you multiply the value of the assets every year at a valuation date by a percentage. And so as the asset values change, so does your unit trust amount. Where do you find the tax law relating to these? It's all over the place, but if you look for lifetime transfers, section 170F is where you're going to find a provision that basically says no deduction for a split interest trust unless it's either a charitable remainder trust or a charitable lead trust, and it's got to be paying either an annuity or a unit trust. And with the charitable remainder trust, it has a cross-reference to 664 of the Internal Revenue Code. In the estate tax context, section 2055E, as I recall, is your statute, basically saying the same thing. No deduction unless you fit within those categories. If you go to section 664 of the code, that's the gold mine of rules relating to charitable remainder trusts, how they're taxed. They're generally exempt. You can, of course, be subject to the unrelated business tax and excise taxes, but the game is, in many cases, taking a piece of property or a piece of a partnership interest or something that you want to diversify, transfer it to the charitable remainder trust, it sells, it's exempt, then when the payments come out, they retain their tax character. And section 664 says all that. Charitable remainder annuity trusts are inflexible. As I mentioned, you really need to be able to pay an annuity and it's not changing, which is why I think charitable remainder unit trusts are popular and they're flexible. And you can draft them such that it's the lower of trust accounting income or the unit trust amount. You can draft them so that there is and that would be a NICRA. You can have a net income makeup CRUD, a NIM CRUD, where basically once you sell an asset and you have more income coming in and you can pay out your stream to the retained recipient, you can essentially catch up. So if you're behind because you were paying out based on income, which might have been zero, now you have a catch-up payment. You can have a flip, which is commonly what happens because you're taking an asset that doesn't pay out much, transfer it into the trust, to the trustee technically, and then you've got an event where all of a sudden there's liquidity. An asset was sold, now you're diversifying into a different portfolio, and you flip, and you've gone from one of these earlier types of trusts, either the net income trust or the net income makeup trust, to a straight old unit trust. And those are very, very common, very, very flexible. And so these are commonly used. What happens if there's a death before the end of the assumed term? Life insurance. You can plan on life insurance. Wealth replacement insurance can basically replace what you thought was going to be the retained income stream. Another point would be you can't have an S corporation be an owner of a charitable remainder trust, but in many cases you can have the S corp make the charitable contribution deduction, and Congress liberalized the rules in 2006 and kept rolling them forward. So there's a lot that can be done with a charitable remainder trust. I think I'm on to the next slide with Bill talking about technical requirements.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, so basically a lot of what Sil was just talking about fits into these categories. And one of the key things, and he explained that from the standpoint of the payout rate is exceptionally important based upon the tax deduction and qualifying for specific requirements. And one of those is a 10% minimal tax deduction. So in other words, the charity has to have an expectation of getting at least 10% of the value of the trust to them in the end of this calculation. So that's really a key one. So that's one that you have to make sure that you have the right payout rate and deduction so that it all fits in. The 5% minimum payout is a requirement so that it forces taxable income to come out. 50% maximum payout is what the IRS has. I've never seen a 50% trust, although I think if you did a short-term trust of a year or two, you could probably use a very high payout rate, make sure the money comes back out to the donors, and then the charity receives it very quickly. But I haven't seen any of those. And honestly, when you're looking at a long-term, as Sil was saying, a lifetime or a 20-year trust, you certainly try to keep the payout rate as low as possible because you want to make sure that you're not going to exhaust the asset. The 5% probability test is specific to the charitable remainder annuity trust because, as Sil said, there's it's a fixed dollar amount paid every year out of that trust determined upon what the payout rate is. And so that dollar amount is fixed. Once that's fixed, then the concern is, okay, how do we make sure that the money's going to be there to continue to pay that specific dollar amount for the lifetime, 20 years, whatever the trust is set up for. So that 5% probability test is to make sure that the expectation is the trust will not exhaust itself. And then Sil also mentioned this on the four-tiered accounting, that it keeps the same type of asset when it goes in, it keeps its basis and so forth, so that you have WIFO is really the way it works, worst in, first out. You have ordinary income, capital gains, other income, and then corpus if you get down to that point, which is one of the concerns with the annuity trust and the payout rate, is if you start getting down to the point where you're eating into corpus, you want to make sure that there is something left there for charity. And you look like you wanted to say something.
No, well, I was just saying, I've never drafted that short a trust. I've drafted a short-term draft, never anything that short.
Yeah, okay. And then, just to give you an idea of how the actual 10% payout or 10% minimum tax deduction fits, I'm going to show you two different graphs. One showing the original, or a year ago before interest rates were being raised, like Sanjay talked about a moment ago. And you can see that with the unit trust, as Sil said, that it gets recalculated every year, the dollar amount. So the 10% rule pretty much fits for the same payout rates for both the higher interest rates and the lower interest rates. So you can see here that for a 40-year-old husband and wife or spouses, 5% works. But you can't go up any higher than that at that age because it's the term of the trust will be too long and you will not get a 10% deduction because the expectation is that the charity will not receive that 10%. But you can see as you go up in age, it gets much easier to qualify for that. But you still see there's a number of them, 7, 8, 9% that fail. So that's why I was talking about earlier, you have to make sure that the payout rate works with that. So the interesting thing is because you recalculate the distributions every year based upon the value on January 1st of that year, the unit trust really doesn't change that much as far as being able to qualify for the 10% rule, you can see you still get the 40-40. So it still works out pretty much the same because of the recalculation. So as we move on to the annuity trust, this is a little different. So if you look at the old rates, as you know, Scylla talked about, as the rates change, the present value of these gifts change. You can see that before you could only, the youngest age you could do a charitable remainder annuity trust was 75 and 75, and that has to pass both tests, 10% tax deduction as well as a 5%, less than 5% probability that it will exhaust itself. But once you get into the higher interest rates, because you're calculating that that trust is going to grow more because the expectation is interest rates are higher, you can go to a much younger age with the charitable remainder annuity trust. And so when you're looking at donors that are looking for distributions that are a fixed income, this really works quite well. And you can see that as you go down, you can see that the ages change. So you can do 65. There was times when we were working with retirement communities where we couldn't do anything lower than 80. So the fact that interest rates have gone up so much really makes a lot of these charitable remainder annuity trusts qualify that never could before. So that would really be an opportunity to create for some clients that foundation of their income in addition to potentially Social Security and so forth. And then I'm going to pass it on to Syl.
We'll be really brief on charitable lead trusts. As noted, the charitable interest precedes the non-charitable interest, and really the idea is to have a growth rate that is higher in reality than the assumed growth rate. So what you're effectively doing is passing on appreciation outside the transfer tax system to your beneficiaries. That's if it works out well, that's why it worked out well. There are two kinds of charitable lead trusts: grantor trusts and non-grantor trusts, and the tax laws are very different with them. So if you have a grantor trust, you can basically, you're ignoring the trust for tax purposes. There's the potential deduction for the actuarial value of the lead interest under Section 170, subject to all the different limitations. And then what happens is the grantor is subject to the income tax on the taxable income every year. It's just a regular old straight old grantor trust in that sense. With a non-grantor trust, there is no deduction up front. The trust would be a regular Subchapter J trust. And Subchapter J, the typical taxation is just like individuals with some minor modification, sometimes not minor, but some modifications, just very few. One of them being the charitable deduction, 642C. You're not subject to the same kinds of limitations that you would under 170 with respect to an itemized deduction, for example. And so, in a sense, what happens is you've foregone the upfront deduction, but the trust is getting a deduction for actual income being paid out to the charity over time. Whether you use one type or another involves calculations. Bill, I assume you do calculations like this from time to time. And so a lot of different variables, and there are pluses and minuses, but these things can be pretty darn complicated. And I would say are not nearly as common as charitable remainder trusts, but are out there, and they are less valuable in this rising interest rate environment because of the discounting that we talked about. I think, Bill, you've got the slide on deductions.
Yes. So the next slide shows four different lengths of time that you have a charitable lead trust paying income or paying a distribution to charity. And as you can see, as the interest rates change, you can see when you're at the lower rate for 5 years, you get a $237,000 tax deduction. But now with the higher rate, it's only $220,000. And basically the way that the trust works, is that the heirs receive the benefit of the remainder as opposed to it going to charity. It can also come back to the donor too. But in a lot of cases, if you're trying to transfer assets to the next generation, this is one way of doing it. And as you can see, over time, because interest rates have gone up, the rate of return within that trust goes up, and that means that the heirs will receive a larger amount so you get a smaller tax deduction, a smaller gift tax deduction. So that's really the way the lead trust works, and that just, a lot of times charities will try to use a lead trust for, let's say, a capital campaign. Somebody wants to do a pledge of 5 years. You set up the charitable lead trust, they get a 5-year distribution to the charity, then the asset comes back to the donor and they get that tax deduction. And there's a lot of people that do that, but charitable lead trusts, as Sil says, they're not very common, and they're usually larger estates that have those. But just showing the effect of that interest rate rise and what it does to be able to pass assets on to heirs or to come back to the donor. And I think that's all. Did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I think that's right. And they get really complicated if you're doing them in an estate. But yes, we know the estate tax exemption is so large now that you really don't run into all that many taxable estates. So Sanjay was good about his timing. We try to be good about ours so that we're not jamming our next speakers. And we can take questions quickly, and of course we'll be around afterwards. All right, I think we will probably turn it over. Jeff, do the introductions.
Excellent. Thank you, Bill and Sil. That was great information and pertinent and handy, when we're talking about the community foundation and the things that we do for our clients and the charitable aspect to raise our business acumen and raise our knowledge. So that way we can speak to our clients a little bit better and then help the community as well. So just kind of tie that all back in. Next up, just to keep things moving along, not sure if you do need a quick break, the bathrooms are out in the front. I don't want to hold anybody from that. But we don't have any breaks planned on the schedule. We got it action-packed. We're going to bounce through this. So next up, we've got a great presentation on the duty of impartiality and some of the aspects that go into that from a couple of great local attorneys. So we have Jarom Phipps and Lund from Buchalter, sorry. Jarom is a certified specialist in estate planning, trust, and probate law. His specialty is in trust and estate-related litigation. Jarom received his BA and JD from BYU University, and he's president of the South Placer Estate Planning Council. Jarom lives in Loomis, originally from Cameron Park, Shingle Springs, so local. Lives there with his wife and 4 kids, loves golf. I'm sure he's wringing his hands looking at everybody driving up and down here. He's got a good view of it. I usually try and sit with my back to the golf course so I can pay attention. Loves golf and watching most any sports. He's a big fan of Hawaiian pizza. If he could be on a TV show, he chose to be on Law and Order. He said he's seen every episode, and I'm sure he knows exactly every twist. He could solve the case in 30 minutes, and 30 minutes of commercials. His partner here, Gray, is a member of the Tax and Benefits and Estate Planning Group for Buchalter's Sacramento and Salt Lake City offices. I almost said Salt Lake Tahoe. A little further, right? He also received his BA and JD from BYU University. He lives in Cameron Park with his wife, 3 sons, 1 dog, hang there, we're still going, 1 fish, and 9 chickens. You got some property, or are you in the apartments? Yeah. Apartments, yeah. If Greg could be on a TV show, he'd be on Survivor. He said he wanted to outwit everybody on the show and win $1 million. And he's also very passionate. I don't know if there would be any elbows thrown here. Pineapple does not belong on pizza. Is this back on? There we go. So welcome for our next presentation, Jarom and Greg. Thank you.
Where's our other mic?
Should be right inside.
There we go. Perfect. Yeah, if I was on Law and Order, I wouldn't want to be in the opening scene because that's when the guy dies. But that show came in very handy in law school in my evidence class, because I remember as I was studying for the final, I'd read the scenario and be like, that's Law and Order episode 18 from season 3. Like, I know that evidentiary issue, we're good. So today we're talking about the duty of impartiality. So what is trust and estate litigation? That's what we do. I specialize in it. And if you're looking for kind of a good introduction to trust and estate litigation, Knives Out. That's a movie that came out a couple years ago. It's a great movie. All right, we've solved your date night dilemma. Now you know what to watch. Really fascinating. But trust and estate litigation is essentially the inverse of family law. So family law is the parents fighting over their own money and custody of their kids. Trust and estate litigation is the kids fighting over the parents' money and custody of their parents. So it's just as dramatic, a lot of high-stakes stuff involved. It deals with large estates, so people are fighting over money, they're fighting over real property, and they're also fighting over tangible property. In this case, I put a picture of a Bible up there because I once had a case that in addition to fighting over the money and the real property, siblings were also fighting over possession of the family Bible, which I thought was a bit ironic. Maybe if they'd spent some more time reading it. But this idea of impartiality, it helps in these situations. What do? Are you like King Solomon? Do you take the Bible and threaten to cut it in half and see which sibling, says that, no, the other one can have it? Or is there some other way to solve the problem? So in trust and estate litigation, we're dealing very often with these issues. So obviously an attorney, this is going to come up. You have to guide your client, the trustee, whoever's in charge of the estate, through these issues. But also in here we got financial advisors, CPAs, lots of professionals, and this is going to come up as well. You have this ethical duty here, this idea of impartiality. What if you're helping a husband or wife or something involved in a tax transaction and they have different financial goals, right? They might have some differences of opinion. Or for a realtor, right, and you're helping clients, maybe your client is the person who's in charge of the estate. And so you need to be aware of these things so that you can guide that person through the process of an estate administration. So the duty of impartiality is found in Probate Code section 16003. And this is what it is in a nutshell. If a trust has 2 or more beneficiaries, the trustee, the person in charge of the trust, the one managing it, has a duty to deal impartially with them and shall act impartially in investing and managing the trust property, taking into account any differing interest of the beneficiaries. That last little part there, really important. Okay? So yeah, you have to deal impartially with the beneficiaries, but after taking into account any differing interest of the beneficiaries. You might have beneficiaries that are different classes of beneficiaries within the trust. So you have to kind of understand what their interests are in the trust. So we're going to do a self-assessment here. Our presentation is fairly interactive. We invite you to ask questions along the way, to interrupt, throw something at us, whatever you need to do. We want to make sure we have a fun time here and get all your stuff answered. And of course, we can do that at the end too. So we have some scenarios that we're going to go through just to kind of set the table a little bit, to kind of get our brains thinking, okay, how does this idea of impartiality, affect us in the real world, right? What are some scenarios that might be impacted by it? So we'll briefly go through 4 of them here, and then we're going to dive a little bit deeper into this duty of impartiality, what it really means, really understand it, and then we're going to circle back to these scenarios at the end and have more of a group discussion and see if we can put our heads together and come up with some fun ideas to try to solve these dilemmas. So, scenario number 1.
Thanks for the introduction, Jarom. I think that was nice. It's nice to look out and see some familiar faces and look forward to talking with you all today about the duty of impartiality. My name's Gray. I'll go through this first scenario just to kind of get your juices flowing, get your imagination rolling about how the duty of impartiality might apply to you, your clients, if you're a professional fiduciary, or if you advise fiduciaries in any capacity, how it might apply to you. You might read that statutory definition in Probate Code 1600 16003 and just think, oh, okay, cool. There's the duty of impartiality, got it. But as you'll see in these scenarios, there's actually some nuance. And so Jarom and I will do our best to point out some of these traps, maybe, if you want to call it that, and highlight some issues you might think about as you move through your practice. And I apologize if this is tough to read. I'll read it. Husband and wife create an ABC trust. Scenario 1, husband dies in 2010, leaving a combined estate of approximately $10 million. In 2012, surviving spouse, mother, amends the trust to disinherit son and leave her entire estate to daughter. In 2013, mother appoints professional fiduciary as a co-trustee of Trust A and as sole trustee of Trust B and Trust C. Mother dies in 2016 with all assets still titled in the name of the family trust. We've got a stale funding issue. Son files a trust contest challenging the validity of the 2013 amendment that disinherits him from Trust A. The trust estate generally consists of a family home, several vacant lots, a fast food franchise, and a large brokerage account. That's scenario 1. Imagine yourself as a professional fiduciary stepping into that role, dealing with that situation. Talk about some of the tools and things you might consider as you deal with that. But that's sort of something to whet your appetite.
I love that. A fast food franchise. Sign me up to inherit that. So, what's interesting about trust and estate litigation too is sometimes people will ask, what can I do to best protect my estate so that no one fights over it when I pass away? And there is a solution, and I figured it out. We're friends now, so I'll tell you it. Spend everything. Leave nothing left. If there's nothing left, they can't fight over it. If there's anything, especially a fast food franchise, you bet we're fighting, right? So scenario 2, I call it gifting gift cards. That sounded fun. So this is a very small issue in an estate, but basically what you have is you have a trust administration that as one of its assets owns about $900 in miscellaneous gift cards. You can imagine that when you pass away, it's all the stuff that you got at a white elephant party or someone gave you for your birthday, right? And so here we got, $200 to IHOP. We got one gift card to In-N-Out Burger for $24.91. So we got this kind of jumble of gift cards that are technically part of this trust estate that have to be distributed to the beneficiaries. And who are they? Well, we got 7 different ones. And they all have different interests. Some of them only have a 3% interest in the trust estate. Others have a 37% interest in the trust estate. Some beneficiaries live in California, where you have an In-N-Out Burger. Other beneficiaries live in Washington, where you don't have In-N-Out Burger. So you have to kind of decide, if you're the trustee, how are you going to divide these up in an impartial way, right? That's going to match your duty of impartiality.
Scenario number 3, no residuary. In some circumstance, some trusts are drafted in such a way that every asset is actually what's called a specific distribution. Every asset is gifted to a specific individual. And that's the scenario here. Trust is drafted so that all assets, 5 different financial accounts in this case, are characterized as specific gifts upon settlor's death. In other words, there's no residuary. Settlor has no spouse or children, so each gift has slightly different beneficiaries comprised of more distant relatives and friends. Prior to settlor's death, settlor is removed as trustee and a professional fiduciary is appointed. Settlor requires 24/7 care, costing about $15,000 per month. It is uncertain how long settlor will live, but settlor has sufficient assets to cover her costs of care for at least 5 years. So, professional fiduciary in this circumstance, you're worried about the settlor, the primary beneficiary in this case, and in the back of your mind, you've got these residuary beneficiaries, these beneficiaries with specific distributions that you're considering. Considering the duty of impartiality, what are your responsibilities? How do you handle this scenario?
Okay, and our last scenario here, this is kind of a monopoly scenario. So imagine you have 2 siblings that inherit this fairly large estate worth several $1 million, and it contains 11 condominiums in Placer County and a couple $100,000 in cash. Now there's 2 equal residual beneficiaries, these 2 siblings, but these siblings don't get along. They don't like each other, they don't even like to be in the same room. And one of them currently resides in one of these condos. But they don't have a right to be there. Mom let her live there while mom was alive, but there's no rental agreement. The trust doesn't give that person the right to live there after mom's death. And now you have to figure out a way, okay, how are we going to divide these up? The other units have paying tenants. Now these units are all located in the same complex. Some are next to each other, some are on a different street, some are a little bit more desirable, a little bit bigger, a little better view. But generally, they're worth about the same, right around $200,000. Now the trustee is not a beneficiary. So the trustee is kind of a third party, one of mom's friends, who's administering the trust and has the power to distribute assets in cash or in kind. So they can sell assets, divide it up however they need to, as long as each sibling gets roughly 50% of the estate. So the duty of impartiality, how can you do this in an impartial way to hopefully not create issues? Because in any trust administration, really the goal is to make sure that the right assets get to the right people the right way. That's all you're trying to do. And so you want to avoid litigation because that's going to take time and money. And so that's what you got to do as you're thinking about the duty of impartiality, is keep it in the front of your mind so you can try to avoid some of these traps that might lead to litigation.
So as you might have gleaned from our presentation so far, Jarom and I, as part of our practice, advise a lot of trustees and trust administrations. But the duty of impartiality doesn't just apply to trustees. It also could apply to other fiduciaries. So now in this next slide here, I'm going to ask for a little bit of participation here. Other fiduciaries. Although this applies primarily in trust administrations, that's where we'll focus our discussion today. It also applies in other contexts. So a quick question, and I'll ask you guys to maybe call it out. What are some terms that are often used to describe professional fiduciaries? Any ideas?
Trust advisor.
Trust advisor? Did I hear that? Thank you. Oh, excuse me, trusted advisor, is that what you said?
Trust advisor committee member.
Thank you, trust advisor committee member. Anybody else? People have heard of like an executor, right? An administrator, successor trustee, of course. Are there meaningful distinctions between these terms? Yeah? Did anybody care? I mean, if you have additional comments, I'd love to hear them. And on the same token, I guess, are there meaningful similarities between the terms? Obviously, we're referring, I guess, to fiduciaries appointed in different contexts, primarily. Well, I think there are meaningful differences, and also on the same, token, similarities, things that are similar depending on the context that you're in. Some other terms, I guess maybe adjectives, I guess, that sometimes get used to describe professional fiduciaries: trustworthy, impartial, maybe, hopefully, unbiased. And okay, I'm gonna move on to the next slide here. Jarom's got it up here. The duty of impartiality is an extension, and by the way, this is a comment to the Restatement Third of Trusts. It helps give some context and color to some of the nuance of the duty of impartiality. The duty of impartiality is an extension of the duty of loyalty to beneficiaries, but involves, in typical trust situations, unavoidably and thus permissibly conflicting duties to various beneficiaries with their competing economic interests. Next slide, please. It would be overly simplistic and therefore misleading to equate impartiality with some concept of equality or of treatment or concern. That is, to assume that the interests of all beneficiaries have the same priority and are entitled to the same weight in the trustee's balancing of those interests. So impartiality doesn't necessarily mean equality. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're treating each beneficiary of the trust exactly equally. Continuing on here, impartiality does mean that a trustee's treatment of beneficiaries or conduct in administering a trust is not to be influenced by the trustee's personal favoritism or animosity towards individual beneficiaries, even if the latter results from antagonism that sometimes arises in the course of administration. Now, as Jarom mentioned, trust and estate litigation, which is often related to trust administrations, some beneficiaries are tough and high maintenance maybe even, and demanding.
Never.
You know, and some simply just request or require a little bit more attention from the private fiduciary, or from, even if it's not a professional fiduciary, your normal mom and pop or brother, sister trustee. And, you know, it's easy actually to get favorites and not favorites when you're dealing with family dynamics.
Do you have a favorite kid, Gray?
I have a 1-year-old.
I do.
He's pretty cool. Yeah. You have a favorite of my kids?
His 6-year-old's hilarious. I'd probably say your 6-year-old.
He's pretty fun.
Or your chickens.
They're only a couple weeks old. They're stinking cute. Anyway, so yeah, you take family dynamics that are already a little bit weird, just naturally, oftentimes, and you mix in a little bit of death and a lot of money, and things get wild, right? And so it's kind of the perfect storm for a trustee, especially one that's a family member, to maybe show some favoritism and maybe provide additional information to one that he or she keeps from other beneficiaries. So there's some additional thoughts. Carrying on here, nor is it permissible for a trustee to ignore the interests of some beneficiaries merely as a result of oversight or neglect, or because a particular beneficiary has more access to the trustee or is more aggressive, or simply because the trustee is unaware of the duty. It is not only appropriate, next slide here, it is not only appropriate but required by the duty of impartiality that a trustee's treatment of beneficiaries and the balancing of their competing interests reasonably reflect any preferences and priorities that are discernible from the terms, purposes, and circumstances of the trust, and from the nature and terms of the beneficial interests. Thus, unfortunately, it is often the case that implications of the duty of impartiality are complicated by the difficulties of determining and the vagueness of some relevant aspects of the settlor's intentions and objectives, much of which is left to interpretation and interference. I appreciate your patience here as I read through these. I think that these comments are helpful, but I just know that's a lot of words, so sorry about that. Next one, Jarom. The duty to act impartially does not mean that the trustee must treat the beneficiaries equally. Rather, the trustee must treat the beneficiaries equitably in light of the purposes and terms of the trust. Last one, therefore, in short, it is the trustee's duty, reasonably and without personal bias, to seek to ascertain and to give effect of the rights and priorities of the various beneficiaries or purposes as expressed or implied by the terms of the trust. So there's some insight here. On the litigation/administration note, sometimes that's a conversation I have when I'm doing planning, right? If the family anticipates conflicts or maybe a dispute that could implicate the duty of impartiality imposed on your fiduciary, maybe that's a conversation that I'll have with the client. Maybe suggest a private professional fiduciary instead, someone that's trustworthy, not emotionally connected to the issues, because some of these emotions, unfortunately, are what can get you into trouble with violations of the duty of impartiality.
Man, being a trustee is kind of a thankless job sometimes. No one really appreciates what you do, but you get in trouble when you do something bad. And so we're going to talk about some cases here where trustees didn't necessarily act in the best way. They couldn't think about this duty of impartiality, and they stepped in some mud, and some bad things happened. So this first case is Doolittle v. Exchange Bank. We have some Exchange Bank fiduciaries in the house today, so thank you for bringing us this case. This is a 2015 case, and a really interesting one, really well written in its opinion. I'm going to go over some facts, and we'll kind of analyze the case a little bit and help us understand a little bit more about the duty of impartiality. So remember earlier we talked about how really the only thing you can do to make sure that there's no litigation in your estate is to spend it all. This is a good example of that, okay? So to me, this is the best defense case. So I put this picture up there of the 85 Bears, which is kind of known as the best defense ever in the NFL. San Francisco had a pretty good one last couple years too. But here we have the settlor, so mom. creates this trust, and originally she names just 2 daughters as the residual beneficiaries of this $8.5 million estate. Now, over a period of years, Mom amends her trust several times, and in the latest form before her death, she provides some specific cash gifts to both daughters. I think they got about $500,000 each. And then she names the gardener, some caregivers, some friends as the residual beneficiaries, and then she names Exchange Bank as the successor trustee. So we're kind of set a perfect table for litigation here, right? Originally the 2 daughters are the beneficiaries, then there's a couple amendments, all of a sudden some caregivers sneak in there, a gardener, right? But at the end of the day, it's all about what Mom wants. Mom can do whatever she wants with her estate, right? About getting the right assets to the right people the right way. So the latest amendment gives the trustee power to litigate and reasonably compensate attorneys, and includes the following. So there's really important language. It says the trustee is hereby directed to defend at the expense of any trust estate governed by this agreement any contest or other attack of any nature on this agreement, on any of its provisions and any of its amendments. So, Mom passes away, daughter filed a contest of various amendments after Mom's death, and Exchange Bank filed a petition asking the court to confirm that as the trustee, it could use the trust funds to defend the contest. The trial court granted that request, the daughter appeals. So kind of some more background about this case. This litigation happened while Mom was still alive, right? So Mom kind of saw this dispute already kind of in the future. And so in that latest trust restatement, that last amendment before Mom passed away, she went out to the best defense, right? She went out, she met with a neuropsychologist. Now that's the doctor you want to meet with to give you a capacity statement. And they met that day, and he signed a capacity statement that day saying that Mom had sufficient capacity to execute that document. And then Mom went out and she got not 1, not 2, but 6 certificates of independent review. Now, a certificate of independent review is where you get another attorney to basically meet with you, read through the document you're about to sign, this trust restatement, counsel you about the changes, try to determine whether there's some sort of undue influence involved by the caregiver or the gardener, and then basically signs a statement saying, this is what Mom wants, right? So Mom's creating this 85 bear defense, right? Everything she can possibly do. She even builds into her trust this language that says, hey, successor trustee, when they attack this trust, use the funds in my estate to defend. Now that's important because maybe the gardener or the caregivers or the friends don't have the financial resources to fight that battle. So Mom wants the trust to do that. So here's what happens on the appeal. So daughter, in the appeal, she's basically saying, you know what, the trustee should not be allowed to use trust funds to defend this amendment because the terms that give the trustee the power to do that are under contest right now. We don't know if they're really valid. So the court should first determine the validity of the amendment, and then if the amendment is upheld, then the trustee can get reimbursed from the trust estate for their fees. Otherwise, daughter inherits a depleted estate if she prevails. There's some merit to that, right? If daughter ultimately wins, and now she inherits, that $8.5 million estate with her sister, there's not really $8.5 million there anymore, right? Because the trustee spent a good chunk of that on the legal fees. So the court analyzed this and said, yeah, we understand where you're coming from, but we disagree. So here was the analysis from the appellate court. They said the powers conferred upon a trustee, including the power to defend a contest, remain in effect until the trust amendment is judicially invalidated and otherwise terminated. It's valid until it's not, right? So we're going to roll with it. All right. They also noted that the contestant, the daughter, has the heavy burden of proving incapacity and the high burden of proving undue influence. So that's basically the appellate court saying, daughter, you got a long ways to go here, and it's going to be a tough battle. So as such, the trust should ordinarily be administered according to its terms unless and until the party challenging its validity sustains its heavy burden of proof. And then they said, daughter, you're not left without any sort of recourse here, right? If you're concerned about the trustee spending a bunch of money, you can file a motion with the trial court asking that the court, in examining some of the preliminary evidence, make a ruling that basically says, trustee, I'm directing you not to spend money, right? So there is some legal recourse there before the contest gets determined to decide whether or not the trust should spend the money. So basically, that's what people can do. So here's the default rule. This is what's important for anybody that's going to be in a trustee position to understand, and anybody that's going to be advising a trustee, all right? Because this rule gets misinterpreted a lot, and I see a lot of mistakes with this rule. So here's the default rule. It comes from a case in 2002. All right, it's Whittlesey v. AIO or something like that. And it says the default rule is that unless the trust provides otherwise, a trustee is not to actively defend against a contest to an amendment at the expense of the trust. And the reason for that is because if you're the trustee, your job is to get the right assets to the right people the right way. And if the amendment merely changes who inherits, as the trustee, you really don't care. You just need to make sure they get to the right people. So you're supposed to kind of sit back, safeguard the assets, remain neutral, let the two people duke it out, and then once the court determines who is entitled to inherit, you're then there to give them the assets. But you shouldn't be kind of coming in and trying to take one side over the other when it's a dispute over an amendment about who controls and who inherits. So now we've got these kind of colliding duties though, right? If you're the trustee, you're supposed to deal impartially with all beneficiaries. So it says, hence, when a dispute arises as to who is the rightful beneficiary of the trust, involving no attack upon the validity or assets of the trust itself, the trustee ordinarily must remain impartial and may not use trust assets to defend the claim of one party against the other. Well, this is important because daughter, she's still a current beneficiary, right? She gets 500 grand, but she's also the contestant, right? And, but the daughter's only contesting that amendment. She's not contesting the actual validity of the trust. When all the litigation's done, there's still going to be a trust there. It's just about who inherits. But on acceptance of the trust, the trustee has a duty to administer the trust according to the trust instrument. So here, the trust directs the trustee to defend against an attack on an amendment. So you have, in one hand, this default rule which says, stay back, let the people duke it out. And then you have a trust that says, no, don't stay back, get involved, and defend this amendment. So here are the key takeaways that we learned from Doolittle, okay? The court confirms the default rule that normally the trustee would not actively litigate because of the duty of impartiality. So because of that duty, you're supposed to kind of sit back, not really take sides. But you also have a duty to administer the trust according to its terms. So if there's a directive in the trust agreement to do this, to actually defend that amendment, then that is your duty. And it's sometimes hidden in a trust agreement. Sometimes it's in the power section. Other times it's in the no contest clause. It'll be labeled somewhere there. So you really have to review it. And that's why it's important to have really good legal counsel to help the trustee get through this situation. So the image up here, this is from a high school football game where a member on the defense caught a pass, so it's an interception, but they started running the wrong way towards their own end zone. And their teammate runs them down and tackles them before they can get into the wrong end zone, right? So we all need good teammates who can stop us from going the wrong way, right? And so what happens in some of these cases is trustees will get involved and start using trust funds to defend the contest on the amendment when they shouldn't. They should be following the default rule. Or, the flip side, the trust directs them to get involved, but they're thinking only about the default rule and are kind of taking a back seat. So you really have to figure out what comes into play. And we even have a recent case right here, 2023. This is a case actually out of Sacramento where an attorney advised his client, who was the trustee, yeah, use trust funds. You can do that. We're going to defend this amendment. And this trustee wasn't even a beneficiary of the trust. Right? That's an important fact here. Right? They weren't even going to inherit, but their kids were. And so they used all this trust money to defend that contest, right? And the court came back and said, you can't do that because the default rule applies here. This trust does not give the trustee the ability to just come in and use trust funds to defend, right? And so all that money that was spent was improper. You don't want to be in that situation. That's running towards the wrong end zone. Okay, our second case. This is Breslin v. Breslin, fairly recent case that came out. I call this the beneficiary day off case. So here are the facts. Here's what happened. So the settlor created a trust in 2017, and then a couple months later, there's a trust restatement done. Now, the trust restatement, this is a great charitable giving kind of case here, directs that the residual estate be distributed to the persons and charities listed on Exhibit A. So it says, see Exhibit A for who gets all this money. Well, the problem was that there was no Exhibit A found. All right, so after the settlor dies, the trustee's looking and they can't find this Exhibit A. So the trustee did locate a document that was called Estates Charities. And it was in the trust binder, and it listed 24 charities, and it had percentages assigned to them with a little handwritten notation. All right, and so the trustee files a petition to confirm the beneficiaries, to figure out who are we going to give this estate to. And the court orders everybody to go to mediation. Right. Now what happens here, though, is that one of the interested charities sends a notice to the other charities and people to inform them about the mediation. It says when the mediation is going to happen, where it's going to be, invites them to attend, tells them that if they don't attend, there might be a settlement that they're stuck with. So it gets sent out, and these people show up, but not everybody. So the participating parties reach a settlement at mediation that made it such that the non-participating charities were excluded as beneficiaries. Big shocker, right? If you're not at the table, you're not there, you got excluded. So I think probably what happened here, I didn't do the deep dive into the actual documents, but I'm guessing is the trustee was not a charity, but the trustee was a family member. So obviously that person shows up at the mediation. Some other charities show up at the mediation. Some charities don't. They got this little form, the handwritten form, and I'm guessing what happened is they basically said, well, let's just take what was going to go to the people that didn't show up, give that to us, you guys keep this, and they all reached a little agreement. They said, yep, sounds good, because the trustee has the power to reach compromise claims. So they can compromise and reach settlement agreements, and so it was well within the trustee's power to reach a settlement agreement, and so they do that. Well, not surprising, after they reach the settlement agreement, they file a petition with the court asking the court to approve their settlement agreement. And one of the non-participating charities sees that, wait a second, I've just been now excluded, right? And so they complain. And also in the meantime, the trustee says, oh, by the way, I just found Exhibit A. But it's Exhibit A attached to the original trust. We're still missing Exhibit A attached to the amendment. But the Exhibit A that was attached to the original trust does list the non-participating charity as a beneficiary. Right? So that non-participating beneficiary is really upset now because there's more evidence that they should have been a beneficiary. So here's kind of what gets important about this case is the trial court basically says, no, I'm approving the settlement agreement. Non-participating charity, you had your chance to be involved, right? And so you've waived any objections you have to this settlement agreement. So the non-participating charity appeals. All right, so here's the holding, here's what happens. The appellate court says that the non-participating charities waive the right to challenge the trustee's alleged partiality in excluding charities by not attending mediation. So that was kind of the argument. They're basically saying, well, the trustee wasn't impartial. The trustee just showed up at mediation, took a big pile of cash for themselves, signed this agreement, and excluded us. That's not what a trustee should do. There's nothing trustworthy about that. It's kind of underhanded. Right? And the Court of Appeals said, well, you know, the probate court has the power to order the parties to mediation. You were ordered to mediation. You were given notice of these hearings. You never attended. You never participated. You were invited to mediation. You never showed up. Okay? And so the non-participating charity says, but the trustee failed in his duty to deal impartially with all beneficiaries. And the court said, but all interested parties received notice of the mediation. They had the opportunity to participate. So the non-participating charity's failure to participate was not the fault of the trustee. So the non-participating charities contend the trustee breached fiduciary duties by approving large gifts to his family members, including himself, who stood to gain little or nothing under the trust. To me, that's really interesting here, is you have this settlement where kind of the settler's intent might have been not to have some of these family members inherit, but now all of a sudden they are, right? So the probate court obviously approved the agreement and it was upheld. So we got these colliding duties again, right? So here's that rule. The information provided under 16060, which is basically that a trustee has a duty to inform the beneficiaries about what's going on, right? And that's what was saying wasn't happening here. The probate court analyzed it and said the notice of mediation was all the information necessary for the non-participating charities to protect their interest. So as a trustee, you don't have to hold the hand of the beneficiaries every step of the way. You just need to give them the tools and the information necessary for them to make informed decisions on their own. And in this case, they knew there was a mediation, they knew where it was, they just chose not to attend. So here's our kind of takeaways, here's the pro tip. To balance the duty to inform with the duty of impartiality, the trustee should provide a notice to all interested persons prior to the mediation and model it after the notice provided in Breslin. So make sure everybody knows where it's going to happen, when the mediation is going to happen, make sure they understand they can come and participate, all that fun stuff, so they have all the details they need. This allows a trustee to approve a mediated settlement agreement that benefits themselves or others to the detriment, potentially, of non-participating persons. All right, now, here's what we have to look forward, right? Because in Breslin, there was a dissent. So it wasn't a unanimous decision by the appellate court judges. And one of the judges basically felt that the way of doing this, right, this idea of ordering parties to mediation and then reaching an agreement at mediation that might be different from the terms of the trust, right, or that might somehow conflict with the settler's intent, is not a good thing. And because it permits a trustee to favor some beneficiaries over others in breach of the duty of impartiality, simply because the latter did not participate in mediation. So as I look at this, there's going to be lots more mediations that happen because of this Breslin case, where courts still have the power now to order people to mediation. We're already starting to see it more frequently. I've even seen it like in Alameda County, where it's almost a default thing. Oh, this is a trust, there's a dispute, go to mediation. Right? And so we're going to see lots more of these settlement agreements come out of these court-ordered mediations, which means we could lead to more appellate court decisions. But at least for now, this is the rule, right? As a trustee, you have this duty of impartiality, but there's kind of this loophole in a way where if you're at a mediation that's been ordered by the court and somebody doesn't show up and attend, even though they've been given notice, theoretically, a settlement could be reached that harms that beneficiary's interest, and the trustee is not liable, responsible for that harm, because the beneficiary could have participated but did not.
Courts love that Breslin case, by the way. Judges just frequently nowadays are referring to Breslin, ordering beneficiaries, trustees to mediation, and they call it Breslin mediation now sometimes. So interesting point. Great summaries, by the way, Jarom. I could tell you got some law and order experience, and he actually does a deep love for these cases, which is great. Okay, so as we saw in Breslin and Doolittle, the duty of impartiality sometimes overlaps and maybe even conflicts with the other duties that a trustee has, or that a professional fiduciary or other fiduciary has and deals with. And so Jarom and I are going to go through some of these additional and or competing duties that are imposed on fiduciaries, and to talk about how the duty of impartiality intersects with and coordinates with those duties. So the first one, duty to administer the trust. This reminds me of the Doolittle case that we just talked about. Probate Code section 16,000. On acceptance of the trust, the trustee has a duty to administer the trust according to the trust instrument, and, except to the extent the trust instrument provides otherwise, according to this division. So, like we saw in Doolittle, the default rule, for example, on that particular trust funds used to defend a trust contest, the trustee was explicitly authorized and instructed to violate the default rule, to go against what would be the standard, and to use trust funds to, defend the contest. Common problem areas. This is it. Like we just talked about, the terms of the trust may modify common statutory duties, such as the duty of impartiality or the duty to make trust assets productive. This is, that's one of the benefits of trusts, actually, is that you can make it say and do pretty much whatever you want it to say and do. And whatever outcome you're looking for, you can design it and craft it to be achieved. So, keep that in mind as you're looking at the duty of impartiality. And yes, in the same vein, specific instructions. Sometimes the trustee is given specific instructions with regards to specific beneficiaries that normally would trigger concerns about, a violation of impartiality. But because the trust explicitly says so, we're okay. I'm dealing with a case right now that straddles California and Utah, primarily it's in Utah, but where a trustee who's a family member and a beneficiary and with her siblings, we're going after her because she has violated the duty of impartiality. Although she'd like to think that the trust gives her permission to do so, it actually doesn't. And what she's instead relying on is maybe side conversations that she had with mom before mom passed away, and she's trying to bend the terms of the trust to be able to do what she wants to do and give advantages to certain beneficiaries that she's not providing to the others. She thinks that because mom said it was okay, that she can do it, but because the terms of the trust don't actually line up with what mom may or may not have said, she's in hot water. And so, keep that in mind. Next.
All right, the duty of loyalty. Probate Code 16002. The trustee has a duty to administer the trust solely in the interest of the beneficiaries. So when you're the trustee, that's who you're supposed to be thinking of. Your actions need to benefit the beneficiaries. So common problem areas, trustees should not engage in activities that may result in increased benefit to him or herself. So impartiality is potentially implicated when the trustee is also a beneficiary. It's really hard to switch hats, right? To be the trustee and then switch a hat to your beneficiary hat. And so we see this a lot where trustees kind of say, oh, I get to divide up the assets. I kind of like these ones. I'll take these. Sibling, I'm still upset because of what happened when we were 5. You took my Legos. You get the not so fun assets, right? And so we also see this where maybe there's closer relationships. So where the trustee has a sibling that they're closer to, then they're sharing more information, updating them, but not updating other beneficiaries that might be stepchildren or charities or kind of whoever. All right, so it's kind of an information imbalance.
Conflict of interest, this is related to the duty of loyalty that Jarom just mentioned. Probate Code Section 16004, Subdivision A. The standard conflict of interest rule. The trustee has a duty not to use or deal with trust property for the trustee's own profit or for any other purpose unconnected with the trust, nor to take part in any transaction in which the trustee has an interest adverse to the beneficiary. Common problem areas, again, trustees who are beneficiaries, who are also beneficiaries of the trust, is a major one. Again, this is the same Utah case, which has the same duties of impartiality and trustee duties for the most part as California. This particular trustee used her status as a fiduciary to craft circumstances that would give her an unfair advantage. The trust in this particular case, and sorry if I'm going off on a tangent here too much, but told trustee to provide one of these properties to the children for bidding, and the highest bidding child would get the home. Well, the trustee decided to, she considered the fact that she already owned some properties in the same subdivision and wanted another one, crafted circumstances wherein she could essentially provide the beneficiaries with less than 24-hour notice to obtain financing and decide whether or not to purchase or bid on this property. None of the beneficiaries were able in such a quick turnaround time to get that done and to have the information that the trustee had to decide whether or not they'd like to purchase that particular property. And sure enough, at the end of 24 hours, trustee then takes, several weeks, months to obtain financing and then to purchase the property herself. Whereas, and that's a problem. If the other beneficiaries had a couple of months to sort it out and figure out how to obtain financing, maybe they would have done it, right? Maybe they would have taken a different path or made a different decision. But the trustee, because of her unique position not a professional, by the way, obtain an advantage that she otherwise might not have. Rob.
Yeah, from your experience looking at trusts, do most trusts contain a provision that the trustee would be required to defend the trust? Is there any information on that?
Yeah, so that Whittlesey case was in 2002. And so after that case that came out, a lot of estate planning attorneys started to build into trust agreements language directing a trustee whether or not to contest or to use funds to defend the trust. And so we saw those starting to happen mainly as we review trusts, kind of in the mid to late 2000s. And it's more and more frequent. That's where you're going to look. It's in the no contest provision. Usually the powers of a trustee section will talk about the ability of a trustee to hire attorneys. And sometimes it'll be in there to engage in litigation, and it'll just say something like to the benefit of the trust, right? But then in the no contest provision, it'll actually have additional language. That's where I see it most frequently. But it'll actually say the trustee is hereby directed, similar to language we saw in Doolittle, to do that. So specifically, for sure, after about 2015 when Doolittle came out. But yeah, if it's a trust before 2002, quite often I don't see any language in the trust that directs the trustee to use funds to defend against an amendment, unless it's a direct attack on the trust and the entire validity of the trust is in question.
I just consider to be careful. Jarom mentioned this before, because sometimes, these trusts, you don't know what's in there. And you can find it in a sentence or two sentences in a random spot where you're not expecting it. And it can get you in a little bit of trouble.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that fast food franchise that the trustee's in charge of, and this duty not to, engage in self-dealing. I'm thinking you can't just walk in and be like, I'll take a number one, put it on my tab. So yeah, we got these duties. There's also this duty to defend actions. So you take reasonable steps to defend actions that may result in a loss to the trust. And so these would be typical, like if somebody's actually attacking the trust property, right? If a third party is saying, no trust, you don't own the house, I own it, right? The trustee has a duty to step in and protect the trust. Or if somebody's attacking the validity of the trust itself, says, no, there should be no trust, I think the estate should pass under a will or some other means, then a trustee has a duty to come in and do that. So, that's that.
The prudent investor rule is something that you guys have all probably heard of. A trustee who invests and manages trust assets owes a duty to the beneficiaries of the trust to comply with the prudent investor rule, which is that the trustee shall invest and manage trust assets as a prudent investor would, by considering the purposes, terms, distribution requirements, and other circumstances of the trust. Exercise reasonable care, skill, and caution. And again, I know we mentioned this before, we're kind of relying on the probate code sections that are applicable to trustees, but these duties are applicable, for example, to an executor or an administrator of an estate. There's separate probate code sections that mention those, and just want to point that out, that if you are a fiduciary managing assets, the prudent investor rule is one of the things that you're concerned about, and the duty of impartiality factors in there here in the common problem areas. Present and remainder beneficiaries, sometimes different interests. They want different things to happen to the assets, or for the assets to be managed in different ways. Trustee has to balance those duties.
Let's skip ahead to the professional conduct rules.
Okay, so speaking of duties, and this is particularly applicable to attorneys advising fiduciaries, I wanted to point this out, duty of competence. A lawyer shall not intentionally, recklessly, with gross negligence, or repeatedly fail to perform legal services. Shall, excuse me. Looks like I maybe have a typo up there, I apologize. Anyway, shall not provide the legal services with competence is the gist here, and don't mess that up. That Utah case that I'm keep referencing, the trustee in that case is essentially putting her hands up and saying, hey, everything that I've done, I was told to do by my attorney. And Utah, although it's not California, in Utah it is a defense that they could raise, and reasonable reliance on advice of counsel. And so she said, yeah, okay, I did all these bad things, but my attorney told me to. Attorneys, if you're advising fiduciaries, you need to have a good grasp on the duty of impartiality, these other duties that we've talked about, because if you're incompetent in that area, it can come back and bite you. Next. Diligence. A lawyer shall not intentionally, repeatedly, recklessly, or with gross negligence fail to act with reasonable diligence in representing a client. So, sometimes lawyers get busy and fiduciaries, sometimes fiduciaries rely on their attorneys, which is a good thing, and they should be able to. And this is particularly important when beneficiaries are communicating with the attorney, and the attorney then maybe takes too long to get, isn't diligently pushing the matter forward, paying attention, and all of a sudden, because that attorney hasn't managed the matter diligently, we've got correspondences that fall through the cracks. Trustee doesn't know about things that have happened because the attorney didn't, tell them, or hasn't been involved diligently enough, and that can be an issue. Let's go one more. Communications with clients. I just referenced this. A lawyer shall keep the client reasonably informed about significant developments relating to the representation, including promptly complying with reasonable requests for information and copies of significant documents when necessary to keep the client so informed. Like I said before, oftentimes beneficiaries are communicating directly with the attorney for the fiduciary. And this is a problem area for attorneys if they're not doing a good job keeping their client up to date about what's going on. Again, and then this also goes back to the kind of the idea of the squeaky wheel gets the grease. Sometimes we have these beneficiaries that are high maintenance, right? And they want, additional information. They want information now. Whereas you might have a more passive beneficiary that's less aggressive, not emailing you every day, not calling you. You could get into a little bit of trouble or get your client into a little bit of trouble by favoring that squeaky wheel more than the other beneficiaries and providing updates, not keeping your client up to date on what's going on. So yes, keep your client reasonably informed. And last thing I'll know, again, on a related note, a rule of professional conduct for attorneys, communicating with unrepresented persons. Oftentimes you'll be called on by a person that doesn't have an attorney, maybe a beneficiary of an estate or a trust that you're helping the trustee on. They'll call, they'll ask you for information, and they don't know oftentimes what attorneys do, what your role is.
But you're the trust attorney.
Yeah, you should know. They think you're impartial, and in fact,
You're actually my attorney though, because you're the trust attorney?
And we've heard it all. And unfortunately, it makes you feel a little bit bad, right? Because maybe in some of these cases, it's expensive to hire an attorney, and they can't afford it, or they feel like they can't afford it, and so they're calling you, just kind of desperate for information. It puts you in a weird spot. You want to help them, and sometimes you can help them, right? You can give them the information that they're entitled to or that they need, but you have to be careful because you don't represent them, and you're not unbiased necessarily, right? You represent the trustee, you're helping the trustee fulfill their duties. And so I'll just read the comment on this rule. This rule is intended to protect unrepresented persons, whatever their interests, from being misled when communicating with a lawyer who is acting for a client. So our go-to, Jarom and I, almost in every letter and almost every conversation with somebody that we don't represent, say, hey, by the way, I'm not your attorney. Don't take this as legal advice. If you feel like you need legal advice, go get some. I don't represent the trust. I represent the trustee or the executor, so on.
So we're going to skip ahead so we can circle back to our scenarios here. We're going to go to scenario 2. This is kind of a fun one with the gift cards. This is our group participation here. We just have a couple minutes left. Let's create a brain trust and see if we can solve some of these high dilemmas worth $800. So I'll go over the facts again. Trust owns $866.59 in gift cards that are part of a residual estate, which is distributed among 7 beneficiaries whose share amounts range from 3% to 37%. There are 20 different gift cards from various companies, and the gift cards range in value from $1.96 to $100. All other trust assets have been converted to cash, and the beneficiaries are comprised of Washington and California residents. The trustee is also a beneficiary who receives 37% of the residual estate. The trustee has the power to divide and distribute assets in kind or in cash. So imagine you're now advising the trustee. What are some options that you feel that you have to kind of navigate this duty of impartiality? You don't have to treat each beneficiary equally, because they're not really equal. There's 3% and 37%, but you need to treat them fair. So what do you think, Rob?
First, you might want to find out which beneficiaries are interested in which cards. So, you know, at least you have some information to work with.
Yeah, you could reach out to them, have the trustee reach out. Does anybody want an in-and-out gift card, right? Does anybody like going to IHOP? Get some more information. Great first step. What else? Right here, Jarom. Yes?
Look at where they live and what's available where they live.
Yeah, you already have the address as the trustee. You should, because you sent out notices to them. So you could already kind of divide it out and say, are there any that are going to be in places where beneficiaries doesn't live that for sure isn't going to be helpful to them? Because if you're giving the In-N-Out gift card to somebody in Washington who's hundreds of miles from an In-N-Out burger, you know, that might implicate the duty of impartiality because it's not really a fair thing for them, all right? Especially if you don't like them and there's maybe something else behind the scenes there. Any other kind of creative solutions? Yeah.
So I've done a letter to beneficiaries before, say listing all the items that people might want and ask them to rank them in order of preference. If you actually want something, send it back, rank what you ordered, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then the trustee would essentially go through all the return responses and distribute them, you know, either by drawing straws for those people who responded and going through the preference in order.
I love that because you're inviting them to comment, you're figuring out what their preferences are, but the trustee is the one that's still making the decision at the end of the day. Another thought on that is you might have some sort of internal auction, right? And say, okay, just send me a list that says, here's what I'm willing to buy these gift cards for, right? Somebody might be willing to say, I'll pay full $50 for that IHOP card, charge it against my share of the estate, or somebody else might say, I'll take it for 25, right? And then you kind of sell it internally through some sort of auction system, right? Is this a big issue that should really be resolved through court intervention? No, right? I mean, it's $435 just to file a petition. So in looking at these duties of impartiality, although there might be things that are implicated, you also have to approach it in a practical way. You shouldn't be spending tons of attorney time and tons of legal resources trying to solve this issue because now you're creating a bigger issue where the beneficiaries are upset that you spent thousands of dollars on an $800 issue, right? What else?
Better yet, delegate it to your trustee to deal with.
Yes, it's there.
Here's the
Yes.
options, go chat with the beneficiaries, you can try and implement this, come back to me if you have any problems.
I love it, yeah. But if you just gave all these gift cards to one beneficiary and then gave cash to everybody else, that one beneficiary that got the gift cards might not be too happy because they might not really use a lot of these. Now, are they going to litigate over it? Probably not. But what you might be doing is kind of sowing some seeds of distrust, where now that beneficiary doesn't like the trustee. And now they're upset because of that one transaction, and now they're looking at the other transactions that the trustee has done with kind of a microscope saying, well, have you done anything else that I don't like? And so that's why you got to be kind of mindful of these issues as you're kind of navigating it. Yeah?
So what would be the issue of just giving them cash? If cash would be the equivalent of getting a gift card?
Yeah, you can give them cash. The problem is we still have these gift cards. They have to get out of the estate some way, right? We can't just keep them in the estate. So they either have to be distributed to one, distributed to all of them, or possibly sell the gift cards. There are companies out there that will buy gift cards from you and just give you cash. And so that is a solution here that you could do. So that way the beneficiaries are just getting cash, so it's very equal, but you're taking a discount on those discards by selling it to a third party. Yeah?
You know, I guess I appreciate the gift card, you know, example, but a lot of times don't you see it when it is the Bible, it's the grandfather clock, maybe it's the
Sure.
duck blind or whatever it is. And so there's a bunch of things that have not a monetary so much, but a family value to them, and then getting that split out amongst everybody.
Yeah, those are difficult situations. You know, family photos, we see that quite a bit, where we have to maybe scan them and do, you know, duplicates that way, but people still might want the original. That's why from an estate planning perspective, I always appreciate it when I'm in some sort of contested administration, if there's actually direction in the trust agreement about what to do. Because remember, Probate Code 16000, the trustee has a duty to follow the terms of the trust. So if the trust says, here's how you divide up by tangible property, oldest child, maybe youngest child, goes first. And then each person picks an item, and it goes back and forth in serpentine manner, right? Or trustee, you have full discretion on how to do it, take care of it, but I want these specific items to go to these people, and then you do the rest. right? There's lots of ways to do it. It's unfortunate when you really don't have a lot of direction and the trustees kind of put in the middle and the beneficiaries are never going to be happy because you can't split the family Bible in half, right?
You can copy it. I've got one with the family Bible.
You can, there are some out there. So we're at the end of our talk, we don't want to go longer, but we want to kind of end with this idea that when it comes to the duty of impartiality, right, it is kind of this hidden duty that's mixed in with a lot of issues that you might not think of right away. It's important to keep in mind that impartiality doesn't necessarily mean equal. It's the idea of looking at the beneficiaries according to their interest in the trust, treating them fairly, making sure they all have the same access to information, treating them in an impartial way, right? But at the end of the day, you still have to administer the trust according to what it directs. So thank you.
Perfect. All right, well, I have the pleasure of wrapping up our event today. Can I get a show of hands who is here and this is your first time coming? Okay, 1, 2, 3. Well, thank you so much for coming. We definitely invite everybody back for next year. It may be at a different location, possibly. I did want to thank CAPTRUST, Bill and Christine for being the sponsor for the event today. So thank you so much for all the yummy food and the event location. And I wanted to thank those on the Plan Getting Committee who spent a lot of time putting everything together and brainstorming ideas of things that we can talk about. And for those of you who have joined us today, I would say feel free to give feedback. What do you want to hear from us? We're really just trying to connect and help our clients together and help our community. And with Bill being out sick today, I don't want to miss talking about the foundation. So you have a packet there, and in the packet, there's a nice little rack card, I would call it, and on the back it says, how we support you. So if you have clients that you are helping and you see an opportunity for the Eldorado Community Foundation to come in and help them with their bequests, perhaps, the Community Foundation would be a good partner for you. They're happy to partner with you. So, any questions that you guys have before we head out today? No? All right, well, I see there's still some cookies in the back, so feel free to grab a snack on your way out, and thank you so much for joining us.